Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Max Boot, who is the Olin Senior Fellow in National Security Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York and a contributing editor to the Weekly Standard. A former writer and feature editor at the Wall Street Journal, he's the author of The Savage Wars of Peace, Small Wars and the Rise of American Power. He is the 2003 Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz Memorial Lecturer on the Berkeley campus. Joining us in the studio is Professor Thomas Barnes, who is Professor of Law and History and Chairman of the Military Officers Committee on the Berkeley campus. Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome, Max. Did the fall of the Soviet Union influence your perspective on the world?
I would say so, sure. I think the fall of the Soviet Union was a tremendously consequential event in recent history. It was a triumph for freedom, a triumph for the United States. But at the same time, it has limited value in thinking about how do you go forward. I mean, it was a great moment in our history, but of course, you have to think about fresh challenges, just as in 1945, we could celebrate the fall of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, but then you have to think about fresh challenges and how do you confront the changing international environment. And that's what we've been doing ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Tell us a little about your education. Where did you get your degree?
I got my degree right here at the University of California at Berkeley, which is why I'm wearing this old bear tie that I dug out of the closet.
And you notice, by the way, that with that fulsome introduction of everybody you've written for, he never mentioned the Daily Cal Thursday column.
That's how I got my start, the Daily Californian.
In journalism.
That's right.
That's right.
Writing a weekly column. I used to say that I was the second conservative in the history of the Daily Californian, but after David Brock defected back to the left, I guess that makes me the only one.
The only one. Only surviving one.
So what happened to you at Berkeley? Did it confirm your conservative inclination because the place was so far on the other side, or what?
I think to some extent that's true. I'm a natural contrarian, and it certainly played into that aspect of it. I think I've actually become somewhat less conservative in a lot of ways over the years, mainly less socially conservative, but in terms of core beliefs about liberty and foreign policy and defense and those kinds of things, I certainly was not shaken from those by my experience at Berkeley.
And what got you interested in U.S. foreign policy, national security policies, which are not the only topics you've pursued, seem to be the one closest to your heart?
Well, it's something I've always been interested in. I mean, I grew up in the waning days of the Cold War when this was still very much of a big deal, and the idea of confrontation with the Soviet Union, the idea of possible nuclear annihilation, and the questions of how do you deal with that were very much uppermost in our minds. And I think that's a very hard thing for people who are undergraduates today to understand, to go back to the Cold War mindset. And I was probably the last generation that was still a part of that, but that was how I was raised. I remember following in the late 70s, early 80s, the debates over the neutron bomb and Pershing IIs and cruise missiles and all this kind of stuff. And that basically taught me the importance of foreign affairs. I mean, this is not something you could run away from. I think we had a moment of illusion after the end of the Cold War, this moment of false serenity after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, when we could suddenly shut out the world and imagine that everything would be fine and freedom and liberty would progress inexorably around the world no matter what we did. I think that was an illusion, and an illusion that was rudely shattered on 9/11. But I've been interested in foreign affairs from the start, and I'm glad to see that the rest of the country seems to be catching up.
Mm-hmm. And for you, in delving in that subject, history is very important. You were a history major here, and what is the importance of history for someone who's interested in foreign policy and national security policy?
Well, the first importance of history is that I think it's essential for those of us with short attention spans, because it tells some fascinating stories, and they're easy to follow and they make sense. Now, relating them to the present day is always a challenge, but I think it is essential. And when you think about foreign policy or politics, it's not an area where it's very easy to do controlled experiments. So the way that you really learn about what's ahead or what you can expect is by trying to make an informed sweep of history and to try to draw lessons from the past to inform the present, which is not easy to do. But I think that has a lot more value than some of the more complex constructs that political scientists come up with lots of equations and so forth to try to explain what's going on. I think a more humanistic attempt is likely to prove more fruitful.
You're preaching to the choir on that one, of course, as it works out. But, Max, let me ask you a question. You've written 2 books of great note, and I know a third is in the way. They're on quite different subjects. You gore an awful lot of ox on this, or oxen on this. And of course, the first of those books is the out of order arrogance, corruption, incompetence on the bench, which is, of course, a study of the courts in this country. We'll hold it up there, exactly. The other one is the Savage Wars of Peace, which, of course, is more recent, and which is something of an underpinning for your Nimitz lectures. Now, as both a lawyer and as a historian who teaches military history, how dare you, without having a JD, without having commanded troops, and I haven't either on that score, but how dare you take on those 2 hallowed institutions, 2 professions, along with the clergy, which of course we don't count in this country anymore, the law and the military, and be fundamentally, at least on the lawyer's part, very, very tough. Now, you know that's a rhetorical question. You must answer it unrhetorically, however.
Well, that's very kind of you to say so. I guess this is both the benefit and the curse of being a journalist, that we're always wading into areas where we know very little, and we're trying to learn a lot. And I think it can be a weakness. It can also be a strength, because when I approach a subject like military history or the courts, I'm really coming at it from the standpoint of somebody who is not an expert, and I'm trying to learn enough to make it understandable to me, and I hope that thereby I will also make it understandable to ordinary readers.
In other words, war is too important to leave to the generals, and the law is too important to leave to the judges.
I think there's some truth to that.
A lot of truth in that.
I mean, but these are very complex subjects, and I wouldn't claim to be, especially in the legal sphere, a great expert, or put my expertise up against that of law professors or judges.
You wouldn't be shocked by the fact, though, that in fact, Out of Order, the book on the courts, received an extremely favorable review, received a favorable reception among quite a few lawyers too.
I did hear from some lawyers who had their own pet peeves about judges, and were glad to see a lambasting of judges occur. But I mean, I enjoyed the legal book, but I really feel more at home in military history and foreign policy. That's always been my first love, and I'm delighted I've had a chance to return to that now full-time, working at the Council on Foreign Relations.
Tell us a little about how the book, The Savage Wars of Peace, came about. What were you looking for and didn't find, which led you to write this book? Before we talk a little about the book in a minute.
Well, in the late 1990s, I got interested in all of these lower-level American military interventions of the past decade in places like Somalia, Bosnia, Haiti, Kosovo, and so forth. And I started looking around and wondering, well, is this something new? Is this a new departure for the United States, or have we done this kind of thing before? And the more I delved into the history, the more I thought, hey, this looks pretty familiar. We were just in Haiti, and we were in Haiti in 1915. But I didn't really find a single account that kind of put it all together and gave us a history of these small wars of the United States and put them into the context of today's wars, the smaller wars that we've been fighting since the end of the Cold War. And finding that gap, I decided to go ahead and fill it. And what really drove me, the impetus for it, I think, was as much as anything the stories. I mean, I mentioned before, the real attraction of history, I think, is that it has a tremendous story to tell, and I was just blown away by the amazing stories of American military history that I was not familiar with, and I think most readers are not familiar with, about these lesser engagements that are very different from World War II or the Civil War. And so I got into telling those stories, but then at the end of those stories, I decided to relate it to what was happening today. And I didn't want to just leave it at the stories. I wanted to offer my own take from having told the stories about what it meant and what the implications are for American policy for the future.
And why do you think, in terms of historiography, why do you think the stories hadn't been told or weren't there at your fingertips when you went to the library?
That's a good question. I think a lot of it just has to do with an understandable fixation on the two big wars that we've fought, the Civil War and World War II. I mean, when you go to any bookstore or library, you see whole shelves groaning under the weight of volumes devoted to that. You see movies constantly coming out about that. And it makes sense, because those were the two most important wars we fought. They've done a tremendous amount to shape our history. And I'm not going to sit here and claim that our intervention in Haiti in 1915 was as important as World War II or the Civil War. Taken individually, none of these interventions was very important, and so most of the coverage they receive is from obscure historical monographs. But I think if you combine them and put them together, I think you see there's an important historical tradition here, and that's what I'm trying to highlight.
You made a good point in one piece, though, the one on the Siberian adventure, the one of the intervention in Russia, that had, in fact, not just the United States in its Siberian end of the things, and for that matter, of course, the troops in Murmansk, but also the Allies, the French and the British, if they had managed to really bring some force to bear, adequate enough to support the White Russian counter-revolution, that the history, of course, of the Western world might have been considerably different. Bolshevism might have been nipped in the bud.
That's a very good point. That was really one of the great lost opportunities in history. And often when American troops are sent somewhere, you hear very many warnings about the possible costs of failure, and that's appropriate. People are afraid of another Vietnam. But I think it's also important to keep in mind the cost of inaction. And in the case of Bolshevism, where people like Winston Churchill, who was a minister in the British cabinet at the time, and General Ferdinand Foch and various others, thought there was a real opportunity to strangle the Bolshevik baby in its crib, and it didn't happen, as a result of which untold horrors unfolded for Russia and the world. And I think that was truly a terrible lost opportunity, where a small war, if pursued a little bit more aggressively, could have changed the course of history.
Were there any themes or types of personalities or political configurations that tended to emerge in a lot of these stories?
The causes of the interventions are very broad and varied. It's very hard to generalize about them. One thing that emerged, which I found really fascinating, was just the character of the fighting men of the United States who went off on these smaller expeditions. It was just very hard for us to understand this kind of mindset, where you would have a handful of Marines or sailors on a distant station, unable to communicate with the United States. Communication could take months. They were really on their own. They couldn't call in air support. They couldn't call in any support. They had to do what they did. And they did it magnificently and often displayed the most breathtaking feats of heroism and courage. I mean, that was really what I think fueled my interest in the book, was just to read about these deeds, which don't get the recognition that they deserve, and all these amazing lost heroes of American military history, people like Smedley Butler, great Marine, or Frederick Funston, great Army officer, or Stephen Decatur, great sailor of the early Republic, who are heroes of these small wars.
And when we got involved in these places, I guess what comes out in your work is that what we then set about doing is very different from the kind of shilbuts that had developed in the 90s, about not intervening, about not getting bogged down, about, well, the military is supposed to have only a military mission and not do social work and so on.
That's right. If you look at the history, we have violated pretty much every tenet of the Powell Doctrine. This notion promulgated by Colin Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that basically we should only fight big wars, and we should only do wars with overwhelming force if we're going to win a total victory, and then leave immediately. And that has seldom been the way we have fought wars. If you look at the historical pattern, we violated all of that. American troops have often been used as quote-unquote social workers. American troops have often stayed in theaters abroad indefinitely. They were deployed in China pretty much continuously from the 1840s to the 1940s, roughly 100 years, with no exit strategy in sight. And those kinds of examples you can multiply many times, that all these things that people assume are the natural order of things are in fact a myth. And if you look at the history, it clearly shows that it's just not the case. That's not the way it's been.
But what is the fundamental ethos of the American military? You know, this is something, teaching military history, I keep coming back to time and time again. There's something different about the American military, and you suggest that it's not what everybody writing history books on the basis of stuff found at the Carlisle barracks would agree is the essence of American military history. I think you've more than got a point. I think you provide a corrective that's been sorely needed. So where would you draw? What larger lesson as to the nature of this ethos would you draw? What are we? How should we? Not so much how should we fight wars, but what best suits us in the form of fighting wars?
Well, that's a very tough question. I think one of the things that strikes me reading the history is just how wide the variety of missions the American military has undertaken have been. Everything from fighting major wars to escorting school children in Arkansas during the time of desegregation.